President Trump's tariffs just got hit with their biggest threat yet, not from foreign governments or angry CEOs, but from a federal judge with a copy of the Constitution. Recently, the Court of International Trade dropped a bombshell ruling that could unravel Trump's most aggressive tariffs. And the Supreme Court has agreed to fast-track the appeal in a constitutional showdown that could refund billions in tariff revenue and send markets soaring, or hand Trump unlimited trade war powers. My name is Guy, and you're watching The Coin Bureau. First things first though, none of this is financial or legal advice. It's just educational content intended to inform you about the court showdown that could cancel Trump's tariffs. If that sounds like stuff you want to know about, then smash that like button, subscribe, and ping the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. So then, two federal courts just called BS on Trump's tariffs. First, the Court of International Trade, and then the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act doesn't let presidents impose tariffs just by shouting emergency. The administration immediately appealed and asked the Supreme Court to fast-track the case. The court agreed, and now it looks like we'll have a decision by early 2026. And all of this has put Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in quite a pickle. That's because since February, thousands of importers have been paying these tariffs, raking in a cash mountain of at least $159 billion so far, money that Bessent may now have to refund. If the Supreme Court upholds this ruling, every company that has paid Trump's emergency tariffs since February, from toy companies to tech giants, gets their money back, with interest. Bessent is already calling this, quote, the largest unplanned government expenditure in modern history. And his estimate of the bill is multiples higher than the tariff revenue to date due to the court deadlines. $750 billion to $1 trillion in refunds by mid-2026. That's nothing compared to Trump's forecast, though. He says that a court ruling against him would, quote, literally destroy the United States of America. So, clearly, the stakes are high. On a more positive note, the Yale Budget Lab calculates that killing Trump's tariffs would drop their inflationary impact from 1.7% to 0.5%, saving American households as much as $1,600 annually. The catch is, of course, that companies, not consumers, would get those tariff refunds. Americans who already paid higher prices get nothing but buyer's remorse. But if Trump wins in the Supreme Court, he gets unlimited emergency trade powers. No congressional approval needed. Just declare an emergency, impose tariffs, repeat. It's the kind of executive power that would make Nixon jealous. Now, while the courts debate constitutionality, Trump's tariff machine keeps grinding away. This machine technically consists of two components. The first is the trafficking tariffs, those targeting China, Mexico, and Canada, supposedly over fentanyl and immigration. Trump justified these using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, claiming drug trafficking and immigration constitute national emergencies requiring immediate economic warfare in the form of taxes. These are the tariffs on trial at the Supreme Court. The second component is the reciprocal tariffs. You'll remember Trump nuking global markets back in April when he unveiled these tariffs on a novelty-sized cardboard sign. Now, these tariffs target basically everything from everywhere, with special punishment rates for countries Trump doesn't like. They are far more extensive than the trafficking tariffs, but the administration is using a different legal justification that isn't being challenged in this case. Whatever their constitutional fate will be, both sets of tariffs have already left their mark, though. February and March saw $430 billion worth of Chinese imports hit with new rates. Then, on the 7th of August, the reciprocal tariffs kicked in, with rates of up to 41% charged on imports from 62 countries. The really devastating tariffs, like the comical 145% tax on imports from China, have been delayed until November. This has basically become the administration's signature move. Announce massive tariffs, pause them for negotiations, rinse and repeat. They did it with the EU in May and July, and with Mexico multiple times. Then, on the 8th of August, they pushed China's higher rates out 90 days to the 10th of November. And just 3 weeks later, a federal appeals court declared those very tariffs illegal. One thing led to another, and now the case is in the express lane at the Supreme Court. With arguments beginning just days before the biggest tariffs kick in, importers are in the uncomfortable position of paying massive new taxes while the government is still figuring out whether they're even legal. As most of you will know, markets hate uncertainty more than they hate bad news, and right now they're drowning in uncertainty. Corporate bonds are getting hammered as companies can't price in costs that might disappear or double depending on 9 justices' opinions. Meanwhile, supply chain managers report that it's impossible to sign contracts when you don't know if your imports will cost 10% more or 100% more in 3 months' time. The financial media have taken to calling them Schrödinger's tariffs, simultaneously devastating and non-existent until the Supreme Court opens the box. Meanwhile, US agriculture is getting crushed from left and right. The USDA documented $27 billion in export losses just from retaliatory tariffs in Trump's first trade war in 2018. Now, farmers are experiencing déjà vu, paying Trump's import taxes on fertilizer and equipment while suffering the brunt of retaliatory tariffs on their exports. Then there's consumer electronics. The US Consumer Technology Association warns that while major items like smartphones and laptops were granted last-minute exemptions, many other devices were not. Gaming consoles, smart speakers, digital cameras, and a wide array of critical components used in manufacturing consumer electronics are about to become a whole lot more expensive to import, compressing margins across the entire sector.
It's the place to be when you're in need of amazing crypto deals and opportunities. It's got savings that you won't believe, like money off those pesky trading fees. It's the Coin Bureau deals page. Sign up bonuses and discounts too. The Coin Bureau deals page. We put these deals together just for you, just for you.
Now, about the constitutional conundrum. In case it wasn't clear enough, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was never meant to be used to impose tariffs arbitrarily. The IEEPA, passed in 1977, gives presidents power to freeze assets and block transactions during genuine emergencies. So think Iranian hostage crisis, not China sells us too many toasters. The administration's legal case is built on a very broad reading of the word regulate as it appears in this law. The law specifies that after declaring a national emergency, presidents may, quote, investigate, regulate, direct and compel, nullify, void, prevent or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, withdrawal, transportation, importation or exportation of, or dealing in or exercising any right, power or privilege with respect to any property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has any interest. What a mouthful. Anyway, the Court of Appeals was not impressed with the administration's reading of the law and put it bluntly. Using IEEPA for permanent tariffs transforms emergency powers into a general license to regulate the entire United States economy, which is a big no-no. The Federal Circuit wasn't buying it either. Their majority opinion read, quote, IEEPA's grant of presidential authority to regulate imports does not authorize the tariffs imposed by the executive orders. Trump's interpretation, the opinion said, would create, quote, a functionally limitless delegation of congressional taxation authority and mean there is, quote, no judicially enforceable limiting principle on presidential power. Indeed, no president in the IEEPA's 48-year history has tried anything remotely like this. Yes, Previous presidents have used it to stretch their powers to the limit, permanently sanctioning, freezing transactions, and seizing the assets of anyone they can get away with calling a terrorist or a hostile nation. But importantly, those powers were prohibitions, telling people what they can't do. Trump is using the IEEPA to make people pay the government for doing something that's otherwise legal. It's the difference between saying you can't buy Russian weapons and saying tip me 50% every time you buy something from Temu. As the Federal Circuit Court pointed out, the IEEPA conspicuously omits any explicit authority for the president to, quote, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Even Trump's lawyers couldn't cite a single example of the IEEPA having been used to create a revenue stream. When your legal precedent is nobody's ever been crazy enough to try this, you might have a bit of a problem. Then there's the non-delegation problem, which will be even harder for government lawyers to wriggle out of. The Constitution says Congress, not the President, gets to tax. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8. Quote, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Judge Jimmy Rayner argued that even if the IEEPA could be read to authorize tariffs, such a reading would violate the non-delegation doctrine, which forbids Congress from just handing its own powers to another branch of government. Another federal judge called Trump's use of the law an unconstitutional delegation that would let presidents, quote, exercise a power the Constitution vests exclusively in Congress. The Congressional Research Service has chimed in too, noting that the whole point of the IEEPA was to rein in the executive, which had for decades run amok, claiming near limitless emergency powers. Congress passed the IEEPA in 1977 specifically because they were fed up with presidents pulling crazy stunts and getting away with them under a loophole in the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. The last straw for lawmakers was when President Nixon killed the gold standard, froze prices and wages, and yes, imposed tariffs, all without consulting Congress. Congress said never again and decided to replace the blank check of the Trading with the Enemy Act with a specific limited list of powers under the IEEPA. Yet here goes Trump using the never again law to do it all over again. The irony may have escaped the White House, but the judiciary has a longer memory. So, the Supreme Court will hear arguments the first week of November, and everyone is trying to read the tea leaves. The administration is sending in its big gun, Solicitor General D. John Sauer. He's using a strategy that can best be described as a hostage situation. First, he makes the obvious claim that regulate means whatever President Trump wants it to mean. But then he drops the real threat. Strike down these tariffs and you'll cause, quote, catastrophic economic consequences and, quote, irrevocably disrupt highly impactful, sensitive, ongoing diplomatic trade negotiations. Basically, he's telling 9 justices that if they follow the Constitution, they'll crash the economy. Say, that's a nice separation of powers you got there. It'd be a shame if someone respected it. As for the court, it currently has a 6-3 Conservative majority, but this doesn't tell the whole story. That's because this isn't a standard left-right issue. It's about how much power presidents should have versus Congress. The court's Conservatives are split between those who champion executive power, like Judges Alito and Thomas, and those more concerned about constitutional structure, like Gorosh and sometimes Barrett. The Liberals will almost certainly vote to strike down the tariffs, not necessarily because they hate Trump, but because they consistently opposed expansive readings of emergency powers. So, the swing votes are Roberts and Kavanaugh, and recent history suggests they're sceptical of executive overreach. Just last year, Roberts authored a landmark opinion stripping federal agencies of their power to interpret vague laws, returning that authority to the courts. That was a major blow to executive power and a clear signal that Roberts believes that judges, not the president's administration, should decide what laws mean. Kavanaugh, meanwhile, has repeatedly invoked the major questions doctrine to strike down executive actions lacking clear congressional authorization. Both justices have shown they care more about separation of powers than partisan outcomes. So you can expect the major questions doctrine to be invoked again to argue that if lawmakers wanted to hand the president power to reshape the entire economy through tariffs, well, they'd have said so explicitly. They wouldn't have buried it in a 1977 emergency powers statute like some Easter egg for the president to discover later. The Federal Circuit Court already noted that imposing tariffs worth hundreds of billions annually is exactly the kind of vast economic and political significance that requires clear congressional authorization. On this point, the administration's defense boils down to emergency means whatever we say it means. Their lawyers argue drug trafficking and immigration constitute ongoing national emergencies justifying drastic economic measures by the executive. When judges asked why these tariffs couldn't continue forever under this logic, government lawyers essentially said, "Trust us." Now, the closest precedent is Youngstown, Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer from 1952, when President Truman tried to seize steel mills during the Korean War, claiming national security. The court slapped him down 6-3, ruling that emergencies don't let presidents ignore Congress's explicit constitutional powers. Kavanaugh has cited Youngstown favorably multiple times. If he sees Trump's tariffs as Truman's steel grab reloaded, that's bad news for the administration. Now, the immediate procedural question is whether the court issues a stay, pausing tariff collection while they decide. The Federal Circuit explicitly refused to stay its ruling, letting tariffs continue despite finding them illegal. The Supreme Court could reverse that, immediately stopping collections and letting Americans import stuff without the government fleecing them. Or they could let the tariffs continue, allowing potentially illegal taxes to accumulate while they deliberate. Either choice has massive consequences. Now, most court watchers expect a decision by early 2026, lightning speed for the Supreme Court, but an eternity for businesses trying to plan. As of mid-September, betting markets are saying that the tariffs get struck down, though prediction markets have been spectacularly wrong before. What's clear is, though, that this case will define presidential power for generations, because either Congress controls the money or the president can tax by decree. There is no middle ground. And now let's take a look at how these two scenarios might play out. If the Supreme Court slaps down the use of the IEEPA for tariffs, then the refund process alone could break the government. Thousands of importers filing claims, each requiring shipment documentation, duty receipts, entry forms. Customs and Border Protection would need years to process it all. And Wall Street is already scheming up ways to make money out of all of this. Trade lawyers and hedge funds are setting up special purpose vehicles to feast on what could be the greatest arbitrage play in history. Here's the plan. Company paid $100 million in tariffs they might get back in 3 years. Fund offers them $75 million cash today. Company takes the haircut because they need liquidity now. Fund waits, collects the full $100 million plus interest from the Treasury. It's factoring receivables, except the receivable is the government stole our money and a court said give it back. Pure arbitrage, zero risk if the Supreme Court already ruled the tariffs illegal. For importers, it's choosing recouping cash at a loss today or potentially waiting years for the government to process a refund. For funds, it's printing money off of a constitutional crisis. And should the tariffs be cancelled, markets would likely explode upwards just on the removal of uncertainty. Every company that was affected by the trafficking tariffs sees immediate margin expansion, and the Federal Reserve could cut rates with the inflation pressure gone. Also, every trade deal Trump negotiated using tariff threats becomes worthless. The EU, Japan, even Canada, they all signed agreements under duress. Remove the gun from their heads, and why on earth would they sign highly disadvantageous trade deals? European negotiators are literally already drafting renegotiation demands for if the tariffs fall. So the wild card then becomes, what does Trump do to maintain the coercion underpinning all of these trade deals? It could be simply to cook up another legal justification for these tariffs, or it could be an even uglier form of arm twisting. Now, with all that said, if the Supreme Court happens to validate the IEEPA as a tariff tool, Trump not only gets to keep his emergency tariffs, he gets unlimited power to tax and wage economic warfare by decree. Modelling by the Tax Foundation points to a 0.8% permanent GDP loss and 800,000 jobs gone if the tariffs are allowed to go as planned. The Congressional Budget Office projects GDP growth cratering, unemployment hitting 4.5%, and inflation stuck at 3.1%, largely thanks to the tariff chaos. Trump proponents, meanwhile, claim they will reduce deficits by $3.3 trillion over a decade, but that's before counting how many businesses fail and stop paying taxes because they've filed for bankruptcy. With permanent tariffs validated, retaliation becomes permanent too, crushing many US exporters. You can expect a swift international response from the EU, which is already preparing defensive trade measures, and China, which is already de-risking from its dependence on US markets. And once this constitutional precedent exists, you can't put it back in the bottle. As the Federal Circuit put it, there'd be, quote, no judicially enforceable limiting principle on presidential power. That means any president, any party, any time. Just say the magic word emergency and start taxing. Budget deficit, emergency. Unemployment, emergency. Too many people buying Korean cars, emergency. The constitutional requirement that Congress approves all taxes, dead. So, there it is. In a few weeks' time, 9 justices will decide whether a federal judge with a copy of the Constitution was right to call BS on Trump's emergency tariffs. They'll determine if massive tariff payments flow back to importers or if presidents get a permanent break glass for taxes button. Markets will either rally on certainty or brace for escalation. Trade partners will either renegotiate everything or prepare for permanent economic warfare. The courtroom drama of the decade is about to get underway. And while you're waiting for that November hearing, why not find out which cryptos Trump's team will be clinging to when stuff starts hitting the fan? You'll find that story over here. That's all from me for now, though, so as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Guy, over and out.